Alright, Logic fans, welcome to our third video on section 4.1. This is video 4.1c, and let's just jump right back into it. What I want to do now is hopefully you've got a good feel for how these work along with individual constants to make sentences. Guess what? We can also use these same ones in conjunction with, no pun intended, our logical connectives. Negation, which you've seen a little bit, but if then, ampersand, wedge, tribar. Okay, so without my revealing it, just take a stab at how you would actually symbolize these sentences. Your hint is that you have to use the logical connectives in order to do it. So pause now and give these a try, again using the same symbolic apparatus here. Okay, so hopefully you got a feel for how this works, okay, but 2 is not odd, right? So we're going to say it's not the case that 2 is odd, right? And we'll use T for 2. It's not the case that 2 is odd and it's not an author, so and is not an author, okay? So it would be symbolized like this. By the way, you can think of this in terms of, if you were to De Morgan it, we'll get to this later, but just sort of showing you how it works. If you were to De Morgan it, it would end up looking like this. So this is also an alternative translation of A here, which is perfectly acceptable from a purely logical point of view. Okay, so either this here all by itself or this here all by itself. Okay, let's try the second one. It is not the case that 2 is both odd and an author. Now, there are these little things that are sort of ambiguous. It's like, what exactly do you mean? I'm going to say it's not the case that 2 is both odd and an author. So it's not the case that it's odd and it's an author. So it would be like this, okay, which notice is different than A, right? So that's an important point, right? A and B here are not logically equivalent. And you can test that with a truth table informally if you want. Let's try the next one. If 2 is prime, then 2 is odd. Okay, if 2 is prime, then, and we're going to get our trusty arrow here, then 2 is odd, right? And that's an interesting statement, but that's how it would be symbolized. If it's prime, then it's odd, okay? And notice I introduced P, okay? If Mark Twain is an author, then Sam Clemens is not fast. So let's do if Mark Twain is an author, right? Then it's not the case that Sam Clemens is fast, which is a bit ironic if you understand who Mark Twain and Samuel Clemens are. So let's see here. It's not the case that Sam Clemens is fast, so it would be like that, okay? And so, yeah, the point of this exercise is just to show you that we can combine all this apparatus with our usual logical connectives, okay? So notice that rather than just symbolizing this, if A, then B, it now looks like this, or if A, then not B, right? It now has a much more sophisticated sort of looking logical structure that's been revealed. Okay, one big question looming is how precisely are all of these symbols to be wielded together, okay? So in chapter 1, when we were learning about propositional symbolization, we had very specific rules that told us how to add certain strings of symbols together with other strings of symbols. Well, we've got the same thing here, and so I want to introduce you to it. So let's take a look. So I've set this up to mimic exactly what we did in chapter 1, okay? So it's going to follow the exact same pattern as what we did in chapter 1. It's just since we're dealing with quantificational symbols, it's a little bit different than propositional symbols, but you'll find there are a ton of parallels. So our first rule for forming a quantificational sentence is that by definition, quantificational sentence 1, any property constant appended with exactly one individual constant surrounded in parentheses is a quantificational sentence. So, for example, what that's saying is that by definition, this, and technically it requires it to be surrounded in parentheses, this is a quantificational sentence. That's what QS1 allows. That's a quantificational sentence. We're going to continue to use our conventions regarding parentheses. So a lot of time we will omit them just for readability. So that's going to be one as well. This is also one. Okay, that's a quantificational sentence. This is a quantificational sentence. Okay, this right here, let's do capital B, little v. This is not a quantificational sentence. It has to be appended with an individual constant. V is not an individual constant. It's A through T for us. Okay, it's A through T, inclusive, but not anything after that. Okay, similarly, this is not a quantificational sentence for us because this is not an individual constant. It has to be an individual constant in that place. So these are, this is not. Okay, this is a quantificational sentence according to rule QS1, and this, for example, is not. According to QS1, this is not a quantificational sentence. It doesn't say anything about negations. Okay, but we can get the negations with quantificational sentence rule 2. So if you've got a quantificational sentence, for example, if you've got a quantificational sentence like, let's just say FA, for example, and that's a sentence quantified by rule quantificational sentence 1, you can get this as a quantificational sentence by quantificational sentence rule 2 done on line 1. Okay, so applying QS2 to this line. So this one here is this one here. Okay, and this is, again, this all mimics everything that we did in chapter 1 perfectly. And a lot of the time we will omit these parentheses and just write it just like that. Okay, so this is a sentence as well according to QS2. And if you had something more sophisticated, you know, if you had like this is a sentence by somehow you got that or another. So if alpha is a quantificational sentence, so if this whole thing is a quantificational sentence, then the whole thing surrounded in parentheses is also, and like this, that is in fact a quantificational sentence as well. And I'm also requiring you in this rule, this extra set of parentheses here. There are hyper-technical reasons for that, but we almost always omit them for readability. But yeah, that is a quantificational sentence. We'll often just write it like this. Okay, omitting this outer one. Okay, and then if you remember how these rules went for after you get the negation on board, it went and, or, if then, if and only if. And it's going to follow the exact same pattern here from chapter 1. So, for example, QS3, for QS3, given two quantificational sentences, alpha and beta, whatever they might be, surrounding the whole thing in parentheses and putting them on either side of one another with an ampersand in between is a quantificational sentence. So, for example, okay, what I mean by that is that, you know, now that you've got these two things, you could write FA and not FA. Doesn't matter if that's a contradiction. We're talking about how to form the sentences correctly. That's a sentence, that's a quantificational sentence by QS3 applied to lines 1 and 2. Okay? And technically the rule does require you to surround the whole thing in parentheses, but again, for readability, oftentimes we are in fact omitting those. Okay, just as a sort of convention. But yeah, and then it's the same thing. So QS4 is basically going to tell you, okay, you can do the same thing with or here. Okay, and then QS5, the same thing with if then there. And QS6, the same thing with if and only if there. So let me show you some of those. So here we have QS4 and QS5, and they're basically the same thing as QS3, but instead of and, you've got the or, and you've got the if then, okay? And sorry, this should say quantificational sentences, not forms. Forms is the next section. Don't worry about that just yet. So let's try to build up a little bit more so you can see some of this in action. So for example, I could say that this is a sentence. Let's do it this way, and you tell me which rule I used in order to get it, okay? And what lines did I apply it to? So let's try this together. So this is now a quantificational sentence by our rules. Which rule did I use to get it, and on which lines? So clearly this is an application of rule QS5, okay, which is the one for the arrow, which allows us to combine previous sentences using arrow, okay, and I applied it to lines 1, and 3. Okay, and that's exactly how I got it. And let's do an OR 1, 2, and we'll do it a slightly sophisticated way so that you can see it. But for example, I could now go ahead and do this if I wanted, and notice I'm using a convention with parentheses just so that for readability's sake, all right? But all these things are defined very, very rigorously, all right? So let's do this. So that's a sentence. This whole big nasty thing is in fact a sentence. What rule did I use to get it, and on which lines? Okay, so that is by QS4 on lines 4 and 2, okay, roughly. And technically, again, the whole thing should be surrounded in parentheses. That's required. But again, I'm omitting that just for readability purposes and as a sort of standing convention. Then, of course, rule QS6 allows us to get the try-bar as well. So let me pull up the last 2 rules, including QS6. So QS6, Quantificational Sentence Rule 6, all right, basically says you can combine previous sentences, things you've demonstrated to be sentences, with the try-bar. So let's give you an example here. Let's do FA, and then we'll do, if and only if. Let's do this, just for the sake of practice. Okay, and technically, again, the whole thing should be surrounded in parentheses, but that's a sentence by what rule applied to which lines? Well, that's QS6 applied to rule line 1 and what is that, line 3. Okay, and then you can just go on building however you want. And notice we have this important clause here at the end, just as we did in chapter 1, that unless you can be shown to be a sentence by repeated application of these rules and only these rules, then and only then are you a sentence. If you cannot be shown to be a sentence by repeated application of these rules, then you are not a sentence, okay? So it excludes anything. So for example, all right, let's go down here, like this here, that string just like that, okay, that is not a sentence. And it's not a sentence because you cannot build that from these rules and repeated application of them. All right, so it excludes certain strings. And again, this is supposed to mirror precisely what you were familiar with in chapter 1, okay? This is how quantificational sentences are built, by following these rules and nothing else. We will be adding to these rules as we introduce more sophisticated symbols from quantificational logic. But for right now, all I want you to do is focus on these ones that mirror chapter 1 very, very nicely, okay, and get those down. That's the goal of 4.1. In the interest of not rushing this treatment, let me spill us on to the next video. So look for 4.1D, where I will give you some examples of, some sentences that you actually have to build from scratch following this type of procedure. See you on 4.1D.